from a kind of cold flu type thing. But you see a lot in conservative discourse, this blaming of what's happening on communists and communism. And then also you often get this where they then all of a sudden start calling it fascism. Like they have this, this horseshoe theory type thing, as it's called. We saw this recently with Keith Woods had this viral tweet where Elon Musk responded to it, talking about tech censorship. A hate speech bill in Ireland, and that could turn into this conversation, this general conversation, I guess, about tech censorship. But it was about this proposed hate speech bill in Ireland, which could potentially put Keith himself in jail. Actually, it's very concerning because of how vaguely worded it is. So. But it went absolutely crazy viral. All of these huge figures were responding to it. And I saw this one conservative commentator, I think it was Cat Turd, who said something like, all the countries of the Western world are turning into fascists or something like this. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, I wish. But, that's the kind of mind of the conservative, is this idea that acting in a quote-unquote authoritarian way is fascist, which is basically the same thing as communist. They have no real way of mentally differentiating between these two things. And they don't understand the history, which is that obviously fascism was created in response to communism. It was a defense against the rise of communism. It was saying, well, the only way in which we can defeat this is by creating our own form, a right-wing version of authoritarian populism, to defeat the left-wing version of it, beat them, seize the state instead of them, and impose our values on society rather than letting them impose their values. And that seems to be something that is just totally, beyond the thinking of the average conservative. If they understood that, they probably would sympathize with fascism a lot more for very obvious reasons. But you kind of have this... this kind of the stupidity of the average conservative is really at its apex when they call whatever we're kind of facing right now fascism. Then if they start calling it communism, it's a bit of an improvement because it's closer to naming the enemy. But then you really want them to keep pushing through that and start talking about the fact that, well, actually, it's liberalism, actually, it's Jewish power, actually, it's all of these other things, not just simply communism. Don't just get stuck in that Cold War framing. We see it with someone like James Lindsay, who, and I've spoken about this a lot on the channel, about how he tries to reframe everything as just, the anti-white agenda and so on. All of these things are just a way to push forward the communist revolution or something. But really what's motivating the far left is just creating a more powerful government bureaucracy. That's really all they care about. They don't actually care about race relations or any of these other issues. They're just means to the end of more bureaucracy. And I just find that to be such a ridiculous notion. I mean, the basic idea of they want more power, that obviously kind of makes sense. But the animus that kind of motivates these activists and these kind of activist bureaucrats and activist politicians and media figures, we can't just simply project this abstraction behind them. I think it makes a lot more sense to just take them at face value and say, well, when they say anti-white stuff, it's because they just really don't like white people. When they say pro-gay stuff, it's because they like their culture war. They like the culture that they want to create. They hate the things that they're trying to destroy. And it's really that simple. But because acknowledging all of those things leads necessarily dialectically to a radical right-wing response, people like James Lindsay have to kind of create this phantom notion of communism, and that this is how the left is going to create a dialectic to destroy liberalism, and you're playing into the left's hands if you start organizing as a pro-white person, or you start seeing politics from the perspective of identity as opposed to individualism or whatever.
Actually, what you just said made me realize another thing. It was the fact that how everyone started getting called fascist. That was another thing that made me look up. Like, all right, well, if everyone is getting called fascist, like maybe I've been lied about what the fascists actually stood for, and like going and actually looking at it. And but really, where we all need to start with this, and it's really, if we had an actual education system, people would not be this ignorant. It's really a tragedy that the more educated people are, the more liberal they are, when it really should be the opposite. Like, if you actually understood the intellectual traditions behind fascism, you would be able to distinguish it from what we have now. But when the Industrial Revolution happened, all these new ideologies were created to try to deal with the post-Industrial Revolution world. And you had liberalism, socialism, communism, fascism. And fascism was about really like a Enlightenment version of nationalism, combining elements of socialism into it. And there's no like single definition of fascism because it has so many different forms across so many different countries. But there's so much there that obviously shows that it's completely different from anything we have now. And I don't know how a conservative can't see that unless they're just, they have their head up their ass. But with communism versus liberalism, that's another like common misunderstanding, where there definitely are aspects of communism that have been integrated into liberalism. But that doesn't mean that what we're in now is communism, because, I think if we were in communism, all these billionaires we have running around, they would be a bit more brought to heel. These companies that are having so much impact would be regulated a bit more. But yeah, there's definitely a lot lost in translation, and it's really a shame. And I'm actually doing a video on the French Revolution right now, and you can kind of see the French revolutionaries were really interesting because they were directly out of the Enlightenment, which the Enlightenment, what it basically did was try to reinvent people's understanding of the world and understanding of how government should work. And one of the main Enlightenment ideas was that the people should run, or the people should be sovereign, which means the people should be in charge of the government. And that could be a communist kind of idea, or it could be a liberal idea, or it could be a nationalist idea. And the French revolutionaries kind of mixed all of those together. And so they actually had some nationalist policies. They had some policies we would consider communistic, and they had some policies we would consider liberal. But these things are not all the same. There's definitely differences. The way I like to simplify it is liberalism means radical liberty. Everything is about liberty. Can we get liberty to do this, liberty to do that? Rights, more rights, individual rights. While communism is about equality. So the more equal we can get, if people are obsessed with equality, they're probably more communistic. I think that's a simplified way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the right take is that liberalism and Western Marxism specifically, because obviously there's a different communist trajectory, which is obviously still currently governing in China, which is totally different. But in Western Marxism and Western liberalism, you have, I think, the purging of the elements which once had kind of held the two kind of tendencies in antagonism. So obviously, if you go all the way back to the 19th century and, the kind of emphasis on class warfare, or the early 20th century kind of Marxists, and the way that classical liberalism used to be, or liberalism in general used to be, where, it was still kind of nationalistic. It still had this kind of rigid, sense of, the rights of property owning males and that kind of thing. Obviously, that was a radically different relationship than now, where liberalism kind of got transformed into this kind of social democratic, mass democratic kind of philosophy. Mm-hmm. And the notions of rights became developed, where, in old school liberalism, rights were really fundamentally based around notions of property, And now rights have been expanded to being, to basically it's no longer simply about your property rights. It's a far more kind of, it's a far more kind of social and egalitarian framing. So like trans rights or gay rights and so on. These things aren't simply about your individual right to engage in X or Y behavior or use your property in X or Y ways. It's about the kind of social recognition that the rest of society kind of apportions to you. And so, yeah, like the very notion of rights, I think, has transformed. We see this with the UN Declaration on Human Rights, where they don't even provide, they say it's too difficult actually to come to any kind of philosophical consensus about where rights come from. We're just going to make up a whole bunch of rights and say they exist, basically. And then they keep adding more and more. And there's rights to healthcare, and there's incompatible rights. Like you got rights to self-determination, but then also you've got rights of refugees, and you've all of these different forms of rights that they just kind of selectively administer based upon political fashion. So when it's when you're talking about like Indigenous Australians, all of a sudden their right to self-determination is really important. But then when it comes to Indigenous British people, it's about the rights of refugees and the rights of immigrants and so on. But yeah, the key, I think, is that the kind of social democratic structure of contemporary liberalism, it really brings the state's role in a more nuanced way, where the state and has to act as this kind of guarantor of mutual social recognition between all these different identity groups and so on. And this is really what Western Marxism has become, because Western Marxism, it really comes out of a response to fascism. Fascism arises as a challenge, a different kind of challenge to the revolution from a Marxist perspective than what liberalism and capitalism had previously presented. And you see this in the works of someone like Antonio Gramsci, who's like writing his, he's writing his theories whilst, literally jailed by the Italian fascists. And he, transitions Marxism into an emphasis upon cultural revolution, upon ideas of we need to establish cultural hegemony, as opposed to, simply having class war, simply relying upon material conditions and the internal contradictions of capitalism. We have to actually actively engage in cultural struggle, because otherwise, from his Marxist perspective, religion and quote unquote nationalism will basically prevent the working class from coming into class consciousness. And so this opens up a whole new kind of tendency that only gets exacerbated in the Western Marxist tradition, where they lean more and more into cultural struggle, quote unquote cultural Marxism. That's what this is. And then you got the Frankfurt School and so on, who define themselves, basically as anti-fascist, because they were literally kicked out of National Socialist Germany, and they really want to prevent anything like that from ever happening again in the United States or elsewhere, Germany itself. And so, yeah, so I've talked about this a lot on recent streams, but I think it's important to reiterate the point that I think these two trajectories, Western liberalism, Western Marxism, really kind of converged.
And they complement each other, because with liberalism, it's all about just giving more rights and endless rights we're just pulling them out of our ass and giving rights to this, rights to that. But Western Marxism actually, over time, it just became completely disconnected from actually doing anything positive. And it just became, so the workers are just completely jettisoned from Marxism, which is, it's supposed to be the opposite, but it's just completely about destroying. So basically the entire Western tradition needs to be destroyed. Certainly religion needs to be destroyed. And you see how these two things just form like a deadly combination, where liberals are just constantly giving endless rights, while at the same time, now you have this idea that we also need to destroy our entire culture and our entire civilization. And so it's apathy combined with malice. And I think there's no better way to describe our current situation than apathy combined with malice at the same time.
Yeah, I think there was a term, I want to say it was it proletarian aristocracy, or a term like this that I think was used in I think the Third International or the Fourth International, to describe the Western working class, saying that basically like the Western working class was complicit in imperialism and white supremacy and all of these things, and so they were essentially bought off by the capitalist elites, and therefore we can't trust them to engage in a revolution. And this kind of justifies jettisoning their concerns basically from the political and focusing upon non-white versus white struggles or feminist struggles or whatever, because the white working class didn't really deserve the loyalty of Marxists under this formulation. But to bridge from this on the discussion of rights, this is actually one subject that really did lead me back to Catholicism. Unlike you, I wasn't raised Catholic. I was raised Protestant, and I lost faith in Christianity in my mid to late teens, and then kind of found my way back in my mid 20s, and trying to work out, a critique basically of liberal rights led me down a kind of reactionary political path. Because I was like, well, where do these rights come from? It doesn't really make sense. I'm not satisfied with going back to classical liberalism and taking a Lockean interpretation either, or whatever. So, ultimately I came to the conclusion that, excuse me, that rights don't exist. And so where does political authority come from then? Because that's really the foundation under contemporary understanding of political legitimacy, is that political legitimacy comes from defending people's rights. And so that led me into deeper questions about, what is authority? Where does authority come from? And this ultimately ended up leading me in my investigations in a kind of complex way to divinity, and then a kind of reconstruction of the social order based around natural law ultimately. And I have a kind of Thomistic view of the political now, where it's like, well, rights are implied by duties and responsibilities. If you want someone to take care of something, or to have, to basically take responsibility for something, then they need to have certain rights in order to be able to carry out that responsibility. Like if you want to put someone in charge of, like for example, in ancient times, in medieval times, under feudalism, you want to put someone in charge of a field because they're a peasant, they are going to cultivate the land, and they're going to pay you a rent, a tax. Well, you have to give them the right to do what they need to do to go and cultivate that field. You can't be restricting them in their farming activities. Otherwise, how are they going to be able to pay you a rent? And so that was basically the deal. It was like, well, you have the rights to farm this land. I'll protect it. No one else can come in and disturb what you're doing. And then you just give me a cut as the feudal lord. And so, rights were kind of given out in apportioned according to responsibility. And this is kind of where we kind of start getting notions of rights from in a more primitive sense, and they get developed over time and turned into this Frankenstein monster now. But bringing it back to responsibility and duty, and this is really, I think, where my kind of ethnic consciousness from a natural law perspective comes in, which is, well, as an individual, I have certain responsibilities to my family, to my community, to my ethnic, that derive from kind of the specific stand of my relation to them. So people don't expect everyone in society to care about all children like we expect fathers to care about their children. We don't expect everyone in society to care about everyone like a brother cares about their brother or sister, or a cousin cares about their cousin, or what have you. Everyone kind of gets that principle, and so just extending that to the nation as a kind of extended family was a kind of logical extension. Where do you kind of sit therefore when it comes to this question? Do you kind of accept that kind of formulation? It's a bit more difficult in America, because in America you got so much immigration that the country is this kind of soup like a million different ethnicities. And I've proposed before saying, well, there is a kind of American ethnogenesis. There's a core American ethnicity. Other people say America doesn't really have an identity anymore. Now there's just these racial identities. There's the white identity, the black identity, and so on, which kind of complexifies things. But how do you see it? Do you agree that there is this, that we have in the order of charity, that we have specific duties to our ethnic group, and how does that really play out from an American point of view?
Yeah, so I definitely do think that people have a duty to their ethnic group to an extent. Like, a country like Poland, I absolutely say should stay Polish. Like, I think they owe that not just to their fellow Poles, but to their ancestors who, fought for Poland and established that nation, nations like that. With America, it's much more difficult because there has been so much immigration, and it's like, that's why people don't talk about ethnic nationalism in America. When right-wingers want to do nationalism in America, it's either like a civic nationalism or a white nationalism. And I don't pretend to have all the answers. I don't know. I'm like still myself trying to figure out what would be best for America, because as it stands, it's just complete chaos. And the country, I think there are some tweaks that could be made to really improve the country, but there are just so many problems. I'm not even sure where to begin, to be honest. But in terms of principle, I definitely agree that people should have a duty to their ethnic group. But I would say that religious principles should be the most important thing. And that doesn't mean that that okays mass immigration on the basis of religion. But I just do think that moral principles should come first. I don't think it would be good to just have an all atheist white country. I think a Catholic country that abides by Catholic principles would be better, certainly from a spiritual perspective. So, yeah, with America, it's so difficult because of the ethnic situation. It's kind of like the Austro-Hungarian Empire in a way, except they had actual ethnic groups who were not intermingled. They actually have their own territories. So it's kind of unprecedented in a way.
But don't you think that there is a kind of ethnogenesis within white Americans? I mean, you yourself, your ancestry is half Italian, half Irish, and that's kind of, I think, quite typical of a lot of the so-called Emerimats, as people, obviously that's kind of like a slur, but as people talk about this, I got a lot of friends from America who are like, oh, I'm part German, part Polish, part Anglo, or whatever, and you get a lot of these combinations. So you think that maybe over time, you were seeing kind of just this white American ethnicity come into being of sorts. Obviously, it's kind of a disturbed process, but and also when it comes to that question of the white, would you rather live in an atheist white country or a brown communist country? People always ask these kinds of gotcha questions.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just kind of silly because it's like saying, well, my family, not everyone in my family goes to church or mass on Sunday. So does that mean that they're no longer my family just because of that? Obviously, I want them to all be practicing Christians, but I can't control that entirely myself. I can influence it as best I can, but I can't control it. But I don't automatically just stop having a sister or stop having a cousin or whatever because they don't practice a religion. And it's the same way that I feel about Australians. It's like I don't just automatically just stop being an Australian, stop caring about other Australians, or lose my duties to fellow Australians because they're not practicing the correct religion. So to me, it's just a kind of bizarre, it's kind of like asking you, what would you rather? It's like as though, the formulation of your country is dependent upon your personal preferences. And I just have this racist personal preference or this religious personal preference. And to me, that doesn't, as I said, it doesn't really make any sense. Like countries are these organic, nations are these organic formulations. They aren't something that you just arbitrarily just choose in your mind based upon it's like they're not based around friendship. Like you could choose your friends, but you can't choose your family. And it's the same thing with I think, with national groups.
Yeah. I do think America has kind of had an ethnogenesis, because what would we identify as other than white people who are ethnically mixed? We kind of have to identify as that, because what else would we identify as? American. A black guy or an Indian who's born here can also identify as American. So that's not really helping us. Yeah, that's kind of where I always hear E. Michael Jones. I'm sure you've heard him say, like, white people need to identify with their ethnic groups. But if you're ethnically mixed, which do you identify as? So, you run